Hello! Welcome to Social Studies with Miss Rogers, World History Edition. We're on our last day focusing on imperialism, and we will specifically be looking at the Americas. In our lesson today, we're going to talk about both the United States and nations in Latin America and their interactions with each other. So, let's get started. The last time we really focused on Latin America was during the Age of Exploration. We know that most of Latin America was controlled by Spain, and Portugal had some large footholds there as well. Over time, Latin America faced a series of revolutions that overthrew the European rulers and created new nations such as Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and so many others. Just as every other nation who fought for independence experienced, Latin American countries found that starting anew after a revolution was not an easy task. There's a lot of work that goes into picking up the pieces and creating a new nation, one which could leave a land very vulnerable. Even with new independence, the lives of most Latin Americans did not improve. Latin American governments seized surrounding land, even land inhabited by Native Americans, and sold it to the highest bidder. The percent of individuals able to afford this land in the first place was very small. Most citizens worked for these landowners and were paid in vouchers that had to be used in their bosses' stores. However, the price of food and necessities in these stores were always more expensive than what the vouchers would pay for. So these workers would go into massive debt just trying to eat and survive. This debt would become generational, meaning it would get passed down in the family and created a system where poor people wouldn't be able to make better lives for themselves. It was a very unbalanced system. There was also a lot of political corruption. During the span of Latin American revolutions, many military soldiers found glory in their victories, and they held on to that glory as they established political control in the lands they helped to free. Many of these soldiers took the role of military dictator, or caudillos. Caudillos did not face much resistance because while under European colonial rule, Latin Americans were used to a type of dictator rule, so it wasn't weird to them, it was normal. In addition to that, the upper class typically supported the caudillos. The caudillos kept power away from the lower class, which the landowners preferred. Voting rights were reserved for the upper and middle class, meaning the wealthy had a majority of the political power in Latin America. When nations in Latin America gained independence, they were no longer restricted in their trading. In colonial times, they were forced to only do business with their mother country. So once they were free, Latin American countries were free to trade with whoever they wanted. Great Britain and the United States became their main partners in trade. Because Latin America relied so heavily on their trade systems, they didn't feel the need to industrialize very much. Many Latin Americans felt they had all they needed from their imports and exports. Latin America would also borrow money from foreign nations in order to build roads, schools, and hospitals, and they usually had some difficulty paying these loans back. Foreign nations would often hold the loan over leaders' heads and sometimes even threatened violence over these loans. This meant that foreign nations had a lot of control over Latin American economics, which turned into kind of an economic imperialism. The United States of America was not a world superpower at this point in history, and the US knew that their security depended on the security of Latin America. There was fear that Spain, Portugal, or even new European powers would try to colonize or recolonize Latin American lands. And any threat to Latin American independence would also be a threat to the United States' independence. The US took it upon themselves to issue the Monroe Doctrine, which was pretty much a threat of, you aren't allowed to even think about colonizing this part of the world. This is our side of the world, this is our hemisphere, so you all stay on your side of the world, on your hemisphere, and we won't have any problems. The Monroe Doctrine was passed in 1823, and there wouldn't be anyone to test the threat of the Monroe Doctrine until Spain in 1898. Cuba was one of Spain's last colonies in what was once considered the New World. Cuba attempted to fight for freedom and their independence in 1868, but they lost. Cubans attempted to fight a second war for independence, and the United States realized their economic ties with Cuba could be at stake if they didn't help and intervene. The Spanish were also putting Cubans in concentration camps, and the Americans did not like that. Fun fact, I know you hear the word concentration camps and you probably think of Holocaust. And a really common misconception that I found in high school freshmen is they think all concentration camps are the same and have gas chambers, and that's not correct. The concentration camps the Spanish put the Cubans in were meant to be temporary, to keep people in there until the Spanish won and could rule their colony safely. The concentration camps in the Holocaust had the goal of death and annihilation. The concentration camps by the Spanish were still not good. They were just not the same level as the Holocaust, but we'll learn more about that later. The United States decided to step into the conflict, and the altercation that resulted is known as the Spanish-American War. The United States strategy was interesting. They didn't attack Spanish troops in Cuba, but instead attacked the Philippines, a Spanish colony. This forced Spain to fight a two-front war, which is very difficult. It means you have to split your troops, your supplies, everything in half, which makes you that much weaker against another nation's full force. The Spanish quickly collapsed and decided this colony thing was way too much work, and decided to give many of their colonies to America. On top of that, America kept a strong military presence in Cuba and took control of their affairs, which really surprised the Cubans, who thought the Americans helped due to the sheer goodwill in their heart. This tension between the Cubans and Americans still exists to this day. As the United States clearly came out on top in this situation, the US government set their sights on a new target: Panama. Latin Americans started referring to the US as the Colossal of the North, not only because of their military and political power, but because of the United States' gigantic size. The US also acknowledged that the size of their nation made traveling from one end to the other very difficult. Traveling from coast to coast by land was incredibly time-consuming, and it was thought that creating a canal in Latin America could cut the journey in half. It was just an idea for a while, but it was turned into a reality by Teddy Roosevelt. President Teddy Roosevelt offered Colombia, who ruled Panama, more than $10 million for the US to be able to build a canal in their land. Colombia didn't necessarily say no, they just asked for more money. So instead of a counteroffer or just saying no thank you, President Roosevelt heavily encouraged the people of Panama to revolt against the Colombians and offered up his navy as assistance. So, instead of receiving over $10 million, Colombia lost its territory, and Roosevelt was given part of the waterway by Panama as a thank you for their help in the revolution. They say that Latin America became the waterway for world trade and that the US held the power of the toll gate. This was a large way of the US asserting their influence in Latin America, and another way was the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary was an extension of the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt Corollary named the US as an international police power, which basically just gave the US justification to butt its nose into Latin American issues with soldiers. It was just a different form of imperialism, a little bit different than the imperialism we've seen before, but it definitely still counts. And while we're on the topic of the US and imperialism, I want to mention how the US acquired Hawaii as a state. It's a very short story, but still so important. Many white businessmen looked toward Hawaii for the sugarcane business, which was very profitable. Soon, American plantations dominated the economy of Hawaii, whose King Kalakaua was forced into signing a weak constitution that limited his own power and minimized the power of locals so that the businessmen and their trade could flourish. When the king's sister, Queen Lilokalani, comes to power, she planned to change this. Queen Lilokalani wanted to declare herself an absolute monarch to strip the businessmen of their power, something the sugarcane plantation owners could not allow. They organized a coup to overthrow the queen so they could continue on with their business dealings. When the coup was over, one of the plantation owners, Sanford B. Doyle, was named the president of the new Republic of Hawaii. Dole requested that the president of the U.S. annex Hawaii into the Union. At first, he refused, but eventually the president did annex Hawaii into the United States of America. Imperialism was a large issue in the world and could be seen all over the globe, even though it took many different forms. Imperialism is going to be one of the major factors of World War I, which we're going to start leading up to in our next class. So, I'll see you then.